The title of this form is conflict styles. So you can also see on just for people who are interested about, like for especially for your assignment, which forum to say you came to on the forum sheet where the link is, it has the title of each of them. Um, and so you can always look there too if you forget or you need a reference for that. Okay, so let's see. So we're on one Facebook. Now we just need to go to the other. Let's see. Copy link. And I need to go to 11 Dangerously site. And share that. Okay, with that, I think we should be good to start. Okay, so welcome back to our Dangerous Love forums. This is our third one. I'm going to start off by apologizing to you. Our facilitator for today called in sick this morning, and so you're stuck with me again. But hopefully that's okay. But today we're going to talk about conflict styles. And before we dive into that, I just want to see, does anyone want to give us a brief little recap of what we talked about last time? Anyone who was here for the last forum?
We were talking about seeing conflict, about our perceptions, smog versus cocoon mindsets, how to view the conflict. We tried to apply that into our own lives and see which mindset we were using and how we can improve.
Great. So we're talking about smog and cocoon. We have these two kind of polar ends of how we're seeing conflict, and one is kind of leads us to the destructive conflict, and the other one leads us to constructive. Great. So today we're going to talk about conflict styles, and conflict styles are actually going to be something that helps us learn how to transform our conflicts from destructive to constructive, or also you could think about it as transforming our mindset from smog to cocoon. So I'm just going to share my screen to start us off. And let me just move this. Okay. So we're going to start with this quote. Would someone want to read this for us?
I can read it.
Okay, thanks.
Conflict doesn't have to be scary. It can actually be the catalyst that helps improve our relationships if we possess the right tools to transform it from destructive to constructive conflict.
Okay, so this is a really important concept that, we can acquire tools, and that's what we're going to do today, is we can acquire these tools, and it's going to help us be the thing that moves our conflicts from destructive to constructive. So in order to help understand, if I can get my computer to work, how this works, is we're going to go back to one of the earlier metaphors we talked about last week rather. And that's this kind of old Viking map with the sea monsters. Does anyone want to remind us what kind of we talked about and what the metaphor here is?
We were talking about our perceptions of conflict in regards to the monsters, so-called monsters in the sea.
Yeah, definitely. And so we talked about how, there's one level where just our fear of conflict is similar to, if you were a sailor out at sea and, you believed in these monsters, just by being in the ocean, you would feel fear because, you would think that, at any time one of these monsters could spontaneously come and attack your ship and sink it. And similarly with conflict, sometimes just by being in an environment of conflict, we experience fear. And there's one thing that I really want to focus on here, which was the question we asked at the very end. Is our fear that we experience from that, is it based on reality or is it based on myth? You can think about that, especially in the context of the sea monsters. And do you guys remember what our answer to that was?
I believe it was most likely myth, because in reality, they're most likely not those big monsters, but possibly natural weather events that imitate something similar.
Okay, you bring up a great point. So these things are likely based on myth. Someone who wants to join, sorry, 1 second. I just have to exit out of the PowerPoint and let them in. Okay, so yeah, so you talked about, okay, so there are other things that can sometimes imitate this that lead people to think that they're a sea monster. So I like to think about this in the context of, okay, so clearly people back then believed that there were really these sea monsters. But we know now, us sitting here, we're talking about, okay, these were obviously a myth. These weren't real. How did we get from believing in these as a civilization? How do we get from believing that these were myths to where we are now? Or sorry, from believing that these were real to now believing that these are a myth? And you kind of talked to one thing, we recognize that there were other things that were causing maybe disruptions. What are some other thoughts you guys have about how did we make that transition?
I feel like humanity gained a lot more knowledge in general, like scientific knowledge and just knowledge about the world. So just learning new things, I think, kind of helped to make that shift.
Yeah, definitely. There was this greater accumulation of knowledge that we got. And so the way I like to think about this is, okay, if you think about why this fear started, let's start there. Part of it was, you'd have ships go off sailing and they wouldn't return. Or maybe you'd be on one of these ships and you'd be sailing the open ocean and suddenly your ship would hit something and start to sink. And people attributed that at the time to these sea monsters. But as we gained more experience and as time went on, people began to realize that there were other things that were actually causing this, kind of like Chris talked about. So we had, there could be weather patterns or storms that ships ran into and that caused ships to sink and not return. Or you could run aground a reef while sailing, and that could breach your hull and cause your ship to sink. And so people started realizing what the real causes of these things were. And when people started realizing that, what do you think they did?
They created, go ahead.
All right, I'll go. Sorry. I think they would adapt to that and learn from it.
Definitely, they'll adapt and learn from it. And so, one thing we can think about that is they mapped out what the real dangers were. So if you look at this map here and versus a map that we have today, or even a couple hundred years after this, instead of putting sea monsters as the things that are sinking ships, we put down where the reefs are. We put down where the stormy parts of the sea are. And we do that so that people can avoid those areas because that's really where the real danger is. And so we start to learn, but we also start to take the precautions and adapt to that. Now that's, kind of this map metaphor, but we can apply that to conflict. A lot of the things that we fear, aren't really what we think they are. But as well, we can learn what to avoid in the conflict by doing something similar and having a map of conflict. And so the tool we're going to talk today is about how conflict styles can actually act a little bit as a map. And it's going to function in a lot of ways that a map does. Not only does the map tell people what to avoid, but it also told people where they were, where they wanted to go, and how to get there. And so all those things we're going to learn a little bit about from our kind of conflict map for today. So this is what it looks like. It's called the dual concern model. It's kind of the technical term that we use to describe this. You may have seen it if you've been in some of the other peace building classes we talked about, but it shows the relationship between different conflict styles. Now, before we kind of dive into exactly how to use this map, we're going to talk a little bit about each conflict style and what they consist of. So to start, we're going to talk about avoidance. Now, did anyone, we don't have a ton of people here today, but did anyone get a chance to take the conflict styles test? Okay, great. A couple of people took it. Awesome. So, first off, if any of you got avoidance as your style, or maybe, you've taken another class and you've talked about it, or you've been reading Dangerous Loves, a little bit about it. Would anyone like to give us just a brief little description of what avoidance is or looks like?
Avoidance is essentially the act of running away from your problems, from conflicts. separating oneself from other people when in conflict.
Okay, great. So we run away, you separate ourselves from people in conflict. Great. So, kind of just like you said, what we often put it looks like is hiding, ignoring, pretending, or suffering in silence in the face of conflict. Now, each of these styles we're going to go through has a need that it fulfills. For avoidance, the need is protection. And we've talked a little bit about that before. Sometimes we feel in conflict, that we're unsafe just being in that environment. This really ties in well with our analogy with the sea monster map. Just by being in the environment of conflict, we feel it's dangerous to ourselves or maybe even just the relationship. And so we run. We try to get out of there as fast as possible. And likewise, each of these conflicts outside of smog or cocoon perspective that goes along with it, that kind of explains that a little bit. And the smog view for avoidance is it paints conflict in general as dangerous to the relationship. Now, if you think, what we've talked about so far with avoidance, if we avoid in a conflict, do you think that leads to a destructive or constructive conflict?
Destructive.
Okay, probably destructive. And why do you think that is? Anyone can answer that.
Leaving people to their own devices in the midst of a conflict can allow people to self-deceive or characterize, straw man the other person for doing ridiculous things, and then it just spirals into more ridiculous things. And then when the people get back together, it's almost like there were two other conflicts that really never happened, that then now it's become reality for them.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts about why avoidance leads to destructive conflict?
I think it's frustrating for if you've got, well, I guess you could have two people avoiding, but even if you just have one, then it's frustrating for the person that wants to address the issue. And builds anxiety and suspense, and yeah, kind of like he said, leaves them to their own devices, which could be a bad thing. And then if you've got two people that are just avoiding each other, I mean, those feelings are gonna what would be the right word? They're gonna linger, and not in a good way, and just kind of build.
Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, like they're just going to linger. We're going to build, and nothing's really going to get done. Terry on Facebook. I want to try to bring in the Facebook people who are watching it there too. Terry commented that he said there's no dialogue and both needs get buried and there's no opportunity for collaboration. And I think what we've all been talking about is there's no way for us to really address what's going on in the conflict. It just gets pushed under the rug and nothing happens, and that leads to it being destructive. Okay. Well, first off, any questions about avoidance or anything else we talked about so far? I need to be better about asking that and not waiting till the end. Okay, good. Well, we'll move on to accommodation. Anyone get accommodation or remember what that's about? I'm going to give us a brief little description of accommodation as a conflict style.
I would say the accommodators are those that are going to accommodate at all, putting their own needs to the side in order to accommodate to get to a solution. So even if it's, them losing the money, or they're losing their dignity or their morality or whatever, they're going to do everything that they can to kind of accommodate the other person, because they don't see any other way than that. See.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we put our needs to the side in order to reach a solution. That's a great way of putting it. The way we often, frame it in Dangerous Love is we always say yes. We give in to others. We give in when others push back. We feel like we won't be loved if we disagree or we speak our mind. And the need that accommodation fills is a need to be liked. And what it does is kind of just like Becky was saying, is it's the smog view, it paints our needs as dangerous to the relationship. Now, again, like with avoidance, do you think this leads to destructive or constructive conflict?
I would like to believe that it leads to destructive. And the reason I say that is because that person, even though they are giving in to fulfill the other's needs, a lot of times they kind of linger with that conflict still in them because there was no real resolution for them. So that anger and that those destructive thoughts towards the other person just continue to grow.
That's a great point, and I agree with you. I think accommodation is a destructive, often leads to destructive conflict rather, and for that very reason, just like you said, it leads to building up this resentment towards the other person that sometimes actually can explode out at a later time, and that's a very visible destructive conflict at that point. But even when it's just simmering under the surface, it's not a healthy way to deal with it. Okay, great. So that's avoidant or accommodation rather. Any questions about that one? No, okay. Let's move to competition. This is probably the most common thing we think about when we think about conflict. This is probably the style that comes to our mind. But would anyone want to give us a brief description of that?
I'll go again.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I hope I'm right on this one. If I'm not, that's fine. You can correct me. But competition is really where both people have it in their minds, like that they have to be right. So it kind of just grows like they're both just trying to get the other person to listen to them instead of listening. So they're just growing off of each other.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's spot on. There's arguing, debating. We're trying to win the conflict, and the need, just like you said, the need that we have when we're in competing is we want to be right. And keep in mind as well, when you're in conflict, the two people in conflict can have different conflict styles as well. So you could have someone who's trying to compete with an avoider, or competing with another competitor, or competing with an accommodator. And we're not going to talk necessarily about the dynamics of all those different combinations today, but these conflict styles can come in any number of combinations. But anyway, like we were talking about, so the smog view here is that paints or others' needs as dangerous to the relationship. And so again, do you think this leads to destructive or constructive conflict?
Destructive.
Definitely destructive. And again, like this is probably the easiest one to kind of draw that parallel there. Okay, and why do you think that is? We'll just have a little bit of a talk about that.
Well, because the nature of competition is to stomp on the other and I guess destroy them, of which then brings resentment. It's kind of like you're in a war with another, hostile war. And I don't know, if you attack someone, the natural response is to fight. And in this sense, you're fighting to be right. And for some, being wrong is like life and death, of which can create a lot of contention.
Yeah, definitely. And it can create a lot of contention, and we're kind of pushing down the needs of the other person. We don't have any sort of compassion or empathy or way to reconcile that and talk to the other person. So that's great. So that's competition. Now we're going to talk about compromise. This is one that I think, this one's a little bit more, well, we'll see. It can be a little bit more tricky. But with compromising, it looks like splitting the difference, giving up things that you want in order to get things, giving up things you want in order to get other things that you want. And the need it has here is to be fair. And the smog view here is that we both need to win and lose to get a fair outcome. So now this is where I think it can be a little bit hard. Do you guys think this one is leads to destructive or constructive conflict?
I think temporarily it can lead to constructive conflict if taken well and dealt with, I guess dealt with in a smart manner. But if compromise is left alone without reconciliation on both sides, it can lead to destructive conflict, letting emotions build up. Because if one side still feels hostility towards the other in a compromise, There was never truly a compromise. It was basically just conflict avoidance.
Okay, great. Yeah, there can still be hostility after even the compromise is reached. Those are all great points, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this one particularly in a moment. But in order to understand that, I want to kind of talk about the last one, the last style for today, which is collaboration. And so, did anyone get collaboration, or anyone want to give us a brief description of what that is? I feel like this is one we talk a lot about in peace.
I can say it.
Yeah, makes sense.
Honestly, I got it in class and then have since realized that that is definitely not my style. It's my goal, but anyway, collaboration is, so in essence, it's when both people's needs are met. It's creatively problem solving. And I don't know what the need would be, but you know, all the other four ways, it's like someone's losing, you know, someone's losing, or both people are losing, their needs aren't being met, whereas in collaboration both needs should be met. So it's the only constructive form. Yeah,
great way of putting it. And I also just appreciate you saying, you know, we all like to think we're collaborators. We all do that, but we all, I hope, quickly realize that, you know, that's not normally our go-to style. So that applies to all of us. But just like you said, it's valuing the needs of both yourself and others. It's creative problem solving. It's a willingness to engage even when you don't agree. And the need it fulfills is kind of interesting, is to be in a relationship. And so the thing that's put as the most important in collaboration is maintaining and preserving the relationship that you have with someone. Oh, sorry. And then we'll read the, oh, keeps wanting to move. So yeah, the cocoon view here is we can solve problems together that meet both our needs. And like Nick said, you know, this leads to constructive conflict. Okay. Let me get my computer working again. Okay, so now this is like, these are two little diagrams that, you know, you can see we have us preservation on one side, self-preservation on another, and then different styles kind of listed underneath. This is here to kind of help us understand an earlier thing we talked about, which is where actually compromise really sets and why, but also to expand a little bit on understanding collaboration and how it differs from the other styles. So looking at these little diagrams up here, you know, we see there's this guy with some arrows and some different kind of people that they could be in a relationship with, and you see that on both sides. What are some things you notice about these two diagrams and the differences between them?
Us preservation deals with us giving outward attention to everybody else, whereas self-preservation deals with inward attention to ourselves. And, I guess us preservation is selfless, thinking about others. Self-preservation is selfish, thinking about only yourself.
Okay, great. So yeah, so we can see that there's this outward tension that's given where self-preservation is all inward. One important thing though, I think I really want to be clear about us preservation, is it's not other preservation, it's us preservation. And this goes back to the idea of being in a relationship, being in the need of collaboration. Us preservation isn't about not having any concern for our own needs. Or disregarding. If you remember, actually, what was the conflict style that disregarded our own needs?
Accommodation.
Accommodation, perfect. And so us preservation is different in that we actually are aware of our needs and we seek to help those needs be met. We don't disregard them or push them to the side. But the difference is that we do the same for others. So you can see on this little diagram, if you will, there's the arrows pointing out. There's also these little kind of like speech bubbles, if you will, next to each person. What that kind of represents is this idea that we listen to others and that we see their needs from their perspective. And then we try to address those as well as our own. And that's what collaboration is about. It's about recognizing others and our own needs and trying to help find a solution in conflict that meets both. Self-preservation, on the other hand, doesn't do that. Now, you can see those little talk bubbles are completely absent. We're not even aware of what other people's needs are, much less concerned about helping them find those needs. And so if when we're avoiding or accommodating or competing, we're really focused inward on ourselves. And we can even think back to those needs if I'm avoiding myself. So on how am I protected, whether or not I'm liked, how am I right, is what those things all fall into. Now, if we move to compromise, which is the other one's a little more tricky, what did you notice changed when you moved to compromise for that kind of red diagram?
The arrows are pointing outwards, but there still isn't that communication.
Okay, great. Yeah, so our arrows are shifted, the communication's broken down. And what do you think that could mean in a conflict? Anyone can answer.
I think the real difference with that is with compromise, with collaboration, you're really working with the other person to try to figure out, the best the best results possible for each of you, something that will help both of you be able to get a good resolution out of the conflict. Whereas with compromise, it kind of teeters on the idea of collaboration, but there's not as much communication in the way that it's not really striving to make sure that everyone's both happy and every need is met. It's more of a I give and you give. And we both lose instead of we both win.
Great. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, and like you said, the communication isn't there. I think there are two ways we really can kind of think about this. One is we are pretending to care about what the other person needs, but we don't take the time to actually learn from them. Like you're saying, when the communication breaks down, we don't actually take the time to learn from them what they need. We just assume it, and then we try to give it to them, and it's kind of this facade of caring about them. And then the other way to think about this is if you think about compromising, we're saying, okay, we're in this conflict over something. I'm willing to give up some things in order to get some other things from you. Now, what things are we willing to give up? Are we likely to give up the things that are most important to us or least important to us?
Least important.
Yeah, we're probably going to give up the things that we're more indifferent on. But we're going to pretend like we care about them because we want it to seem like we're giving up these great things. And really what actually it kind of turns up in is that we are focused still on getting what we want. And in some ways, we're almost like competitors under this disguise of collaboration, where we're fighting to get the thing that's most important to us. And just the strategy we've adopted in the course of doing that is, okay, well, I'll give up some of these other less important things that I want. So does anyone have any questions about that, about the difference between collaboration and compromise, or about any of these things we've talked about so far? Okay, well, we'll move on. So this brings us back to our map. So hopefully now we have a good solid understanding of what the different conflict styles are and what they entail. And now we're going to talk about how to read this map to kind of help us in our conflicts, do a couple things. So the first thing we want to talk about is understanding how this map helps us know where we are. Now, either from taking the conflict test or even just listening today and maybe resonating with one of the styles, hopefully you kind of know where you feel like you generally sit on this. So let's say for me, hypothetically, I took this test maybe, and I was an accommodator. And if I'm an accommodator, okay, we can see me, I'm kind of on the bottom. There's me with my little flag. My head's down. And you can see that there's two kind of things we measure here on this graph and this map. So you can have self-concern, and it can be low or high. And then you can have other concern. You can see that one's on the bottom, and that can either be low or high. Now, if I'm an accommodator, and we're just going to use that as an example here, where's my other concern?
Hi.
Hi, I have a large concern for the needs of other people. I often see them, I know about them, and I help them get it. But where's my self-concern?
Low.
Great, simultaneously. low. We have low concern for ourselves. So that kind of tells us where we are in the mixture of those two things. Now we want to know where do we want to go? Nick, you kind of talked about it earlier. What's kind of the ideal conflict style that leads to constructive conflict? Collaborating. And so we want to move, if I'm an accommodator, I want to move from accommodating to collaborating. Now, the way we do that, the way we move between them is we think again about the low concern for self, or the low and high concern for self and the low and high concern for others. So we said before, I'm an accommodator. I have low concern. Oh, well, maybe the first thing we should say is where's collaboration on those two things? Where is collaboration on self and other concern?
Self-concern, other concern are high.
They're both high. And so if I'm an accommodator and I have high other concern, but low self-concern, what do I need to work on to move up?
You may need to recognize your own needs in contrast to others' needs and prioritize both the same way.
Perfect. And so what I need to do is I need to start being able to learn, and sometimes we even need to figure out for ourselves what our needs are in the conflict, and start working towards them and prioritizing and putting value on them at the same time. And if we do that, then our self-concern starts to go up, and that's going to just intrinsically push us to act in conflict in a way that's more collaborative, because we're still going to maintain that need for others and that high concern that we have for them, but also start to work on our own. Now, the other thing this map does is it also tells us some things to avoid when we're in conflict. We talked about before with the sea monster map, some of the reefs and storms that we want to avoid. And the best way I can explain this, I think, is going back to, thinking about accommodating as our example. If I'm an accommodator, there are two kind of ways I can think about increasing my self-concern. One way is I could think, okay, well, there's a lot of different ways you could think about this, but this is just to give some contrast here. One could be, I go to the person I'm in conflict with, and we try to have a conversation about both of our needs. And, I explain, like, I know you need these things and I want to try to help you get them, but these are what I need. And I need you to try to help me get them. We have a conversation about that. But another way we could do it is we could go up to this person and be like, you know what, I'm done. I'm fed up. I'm done, giving you what you want. You kind of pushed me around for, however long this conflict's lasted. And I'm standing up for myself and I'm not having it anymore. And from now on, these are what I need, and they're non-negotiable. Take it or leave it. And if we kind of take that second approach, what do you think starts to happen? Where do you think we actually move on this graph?
I guess in that sense it moves to competing.
Perfect. We move to competing because what we've actually started to do is, in our pursuit of increasing our self-concern, we've started sacrificing our concern for others. And that same pattern can happen if you're a competitor. You could feel, you could listen to this or read Dangerous Love and be like, man, I compete all the time. I'm so rude. I can't believe I do that. In this conflict, I'm just going to give them everything I want because I've been a terrible person. And I just need to, let go of it all now. Or if you're an avoider, you can see if you're an avoider or compromiser, you kind of need to work on both because you're low on both ends. You could be like, well, I'm just going to work on other concern, or I'm just going to work on self-concern and worry about the other one later. But we inevitably actually just move towards another destructive conflict style. And so what we learn to avoid is, and the principle here is that when wherever we are, we don't want to sacrifice either self or other concern to get the other. If we're an accommodator or competitor, we want to actually hold on to whichever one we already have and make sure that we're not sacrificing that in the pursuit of obtaining the other. And if we're an avoider or a compromiser, we want to make sure that we're taking our time to work on both of those simultaneously. And so that's how we kind of use this as a map. It helps us know where we are, where we want to go, how to actually make that transition, and then also what to avoid. Any questions about that, or how that works, or anything there? No? Okay. Now, and I think, one other thing I just want to mention here is I think, the whole point of we're talking about this is we're trying to talk about how do we overcome our fear of conflict. And I think there's two ways that understanding this helps overcome our fear of conflict. I think one, I think it just gives us more knowledge. And I think when we, part of our fear, I think sometimes in conflict is fear of the unknown. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what's really going to happen. but this gives us a little bit more concrete knowledge about what's really going on in conflict and how to act. And I think the second thing is it shifts our focus. I think sometimes when we're afraid in conflict, that fear is what we think about the whole time. What we're worried about is going to happen, and our mind gets centered on that fear. But when we start to understand the different conflict styles, how to move between them, the self and other concern, we start to ask ourselves different questions. Instead of asking ourselves, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? And I have no idea. We stop focusing on that, and we start focusing, okay, how can I be better at valuing my own concerns? How can I be better at valuing their concerns? How can I make sure that we're both getting what we need? And we start thinking about this in somewhat a more analytical way, but also just, I think, in a way that helps move the conflict forward and gets us out of this rut of just thinking about the fear that we're experiencing. Okay, so that's a little bit about the map. So what we do now, if we were in a full-blown workshop, we'd have breakout rooms for each of these. So, if you took the test, you were a compromiser or a competitor, you'd go into that breakout room and you talk with other people who are compromisers or competitors about how to make that shift. But we can't really do that on Facebook Live. So we're just, and also going to record if we went into those. So, people watching this when we get that. So we're just going to have a little bit, all together. We're just going to have a little bit of discussion about each of these. So we'll start with avoidance. And what we're just talking about here is, I just have a discussion about how do we make the move from avoidance, competing, compromise, or accommodation? How do we make the move from that to collaboration? And so we'll start with avoidance. And there's no right or wrong answers here. We're just trying to figure it out. So let's start with avoidance. How do you guys think we make that move from avoidance to collaboration?
At least, I think that we can make that move by letting go of whatever fear we have of the other person and of ourselves. And then we recognize what's important to us in all of our issues and what's important to the other and their issues. We try to, communicate with them first, because most likely if we're avoiding the other person, communication between both parties is probably going to be very low and practically non-existent. So you're going to have to build a relationship there. Then once you find out both needs, you just keep on building the relationship, working together, and I guess at that point you're more so beginning to compromise, because as you become friends, really, your self-concern becomes their other concern, and your other concern becomes their self-concern. I don't know if I got that right. But as you become better friends, the relationship builds. You don't fear the other person as much. And instead, once you reach a conflict again, you now have that background with each other. You start collaborating towards the conflict, making sure that both needs are met. You see the other person as a person, using the I thou mindset instead of the I it. And at that point, I guess you would be at the collaboration point. And then just kind of all history from there.
Okay, great. Other thoughts on how do we move from avoidance to collaboration?
Hi, I just want to kind of go off of what Christopher said. I think it's important that, when we're in a conflict with somebody, it's important to create a space, a safe space for both people to be in or groups of people to be in, so that you can come up with a possibility or solution.
Great comment. Yeah, creating that safe space is really important because, just like with our sea monster analogy, with avoidance, more than any other conflict style, just by being in conflict feels scary and evokes fear. But if we can create a safe space, either for ourselves or also if we're in a conflict with someone who we feel like is an avoider, we can try to help create that safe space. That's going to make a huge difference in helping us start to move to collaborative style. Awesome. Any other thoughts?
I actually have a question to
Great.
go on. Was it Lena? Is it Lena or Lena?
Hi, it's Lena.
Lena, how would you suggest creating a safe space? And I'm not like debating, I'm really wondering, because that's my aptitude is to avoid conflict. So,
Well, no, I totally agree. I mean, so in my own life, I'm going through some conflict, right? And so I'm living with it. But since taking these courses, I had to learn how to view the other person that I'm in conflict with as somebody that I once knew before I had the conflict with, you know? I had to kind of remember, all the things that I loved and liked about this person. And then I had to realize what my role was on how I create, I contributed to the conflict. And then I kind of had to sit back, and which I'm doing now, and filter in all of these things that I'm learning here in this class. And right now at this point, I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there to try. And every time I want to get into that mode where I'm like getting ready to get pissed off at that person, I have to quickly ask myself, um, what are some of the things that I'm doing to contribute to that, and then what are some of the good things that she is doing right now, or he is doing right now, that are making me, you know, see them as a person. I mean, that's just some of the things that I'm doing. One thing that I read in chapter 12 on in our book, Not Dangerous Love, but Anatomy of Peace, was action, the word action. And action, the he the guy talks about we can do all these things. We can recognize all the things that are giving us conflict, and we can understand why we have the conflict. But if we don't work towards um, fixing the conflict, then everything is dead. You know what I mean? There's nothing's moving. And I kind of liken that to the example in church. Faith without, faith without works is dead. You know what I mean? So I hope I didn't confuse you, but that's just some of the stuff that I'm doing right now. Sorry, guys.
no, thank you so much. I really appreciate your help.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. That was great. But I think this is a great question. How to create that safe space? I just want to open it up. Does anyone else have any comments, anything they want to say about, how they've been able to do that in their lives, or just thoughts on how to create that safe space? I think that's a great thing to talk about.
I can speak on that for a sec. I noticed when, being older and dating, there's a lot of trauma people have from relationships. And so one of the things that I made it a point to anytime I went on a date was, especially the first date, is just to totally tell them, look, what you say, what you've done in your life, or what you haven't done, or what you said or haven't said won't change the way that I feel about you. And that kind of set that stage where they could feel that they were free to be themselves. They could express themselves, because people close up because they're afraid of how someone's going to react to how who they are, right? If I really expose who I am, is that person going to accept me? If I really tell them what I'm really thinking in my mind, are they going to judge me? And when I learned when I could express myself that way, that all of a sudden it was like all the walls came down, and I would be careful that when they would share something with me, I wouldn't respond. I wouldn't even look. My facial expressions wouldn't show them shame, wouldn't show them judgment. I would tell me a little bit more about that. You know what I mean? And just express love with that. And because that's what they're not used to, is for somebody to show and express that love. They're used to judgment and condemning, and, oh, that's horrible, and, oh, I'm never going to date him again. You know what I mean? And it doesn't matter if it's a dating situation. It's like, even with this mediation, it's like, if they can feel so safe that is at least not coming from you, but that's me doing my own personal work. and I'm not perfect at it. I mean, I'm always checking myself, my come from when I'm in relationship and talking to people, because I go in and out of the box all the time. So it really starts with me first, and then expressing that in order to give them that safe space.
Great, thank you. Cool. Well, any other thoughts about that before we move on to our next one? I think these are great advice.
I have a small experience. This is a year ago. I was doing some esports stuff with some friends online. We had a whole community, and conflict, because this was dealing with like 14, 15, 16-year-olds, and I was 17 at the time. I was acting as the mediator, the mediator for the group, and the main issue between the two parties is that nobody understood each other. They all viewed each other as, you did this or they did that. And I think it was during a tournament too. Yeah, it was a tournament. And I do know that that time I was poorly equipped, if I was equipped at all. And you know, for them, a safe space would have been that they could just speak out their minds. Nobody will be judging them, even though that maybe the mods and the admins of the tournament would be listening to try to figure out the problem. But for them, all they have to do is speak out their minds, pour out their feelings, and just kind of make sure that they didn't fear anything. The same goes for the other party, and they just pour out their feelings, say whatever they wanted to say, whatever they felt at the time. Like kind of let them sit on it in silence, maybe whatever they needed.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. That's a great experience, and I think it really highlights this idea that sometimes the reason we avoid is because we can often assume things about the other people or be afraid of them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about fear of the people we're in conflict with in a few weeks. That's another thing we talk about specifically. And sometimes what we need to just do is change how we see them and not assume. When we assume that if we share our needs with someone, that it's going to evoke a bad response or they're going to be upset with us for sharing our needs. We're assuming the worst about that person. And we don't really think about it in terms of we're in the moment because we feel afraid. We feel afraid of bringing it up. But part of, especially if we're in Anatomy of Peace right now, part of the getting out of the box process there is, not assuming the worst about people and doing that, and actually, giving them a chance to respond respectfully and constructively to you sharing your needs. Now, that takes courage. And I think that's going to be part of any of this, creating a safe space, especially if you're someone who has a tendency to avoid. I'm actually a avoider. I took the test last week, so I wanted to see what I was. I was an avoider. And I think that it does take courage to try to sort of do that if you're the one in that position. But does that help give you some ideas? Great. Look at that, practically useful, the workshop. Thank you. And thank you everyone who commented on that. I really appreciate that. We'll move on to our next one, competition. So again, our question here is, how do we move from competition to collaboration? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
If I can go again, I'd say in competition, you'd probably best just take some time, just kind of remove yourself from the equation, put yourself into your opponent's shoes, and kind of look at yourself from their perspective. Review who you are from their perspective and what you have done and how you would have felt if you did that to yourself, if you yourself were to be another person. And from there, I guess you can reverse engineer your needs to say what other people's needs are going to be, and then in that sense, you put away your trophy, lock it up in a safe, can just talk to people, and from there, in talking to them, you try to find out, just kind of finding out what you have done to maybe hurt them, what you've done to what you may have done to maybe affect their lives in one sort of way or another, and then try to feel remorse for what you have done, and kind of sympathize with them. If they don't accept it, just know that you have taken that step to try to I don't know, help yourself go right, I guess, in a way. That was the lower part of the influence pyramid later on to the Anatomy of Peace book. And I guess when communicating with others, building that relationship, you kind of, I don't know, kind of take the trophy out, but not holding it up above your head, but like putting it on a table with everyone else, I guess, if I were to use that analogy. And yeah, just make sure that afterwards, when you've built a relationship with everyone, that you don't try to compete again, and instead you just kind of take a humble approach to everyone else.
Great. And one thing we're going to learn, I like that analogy of, putting out the trophy on the table kind of for everyone, because one of the things we'll look at, this will be in a couple weeks, when we talk about conflict escalation, one of the things we're going to see is that really when you compete, and it kind of relates to all of them, but whenever you engage in destructive conflict, no one wins. Even if you feel like you, as the person came out on top, everything that goes on, all the cost of putting into that conflict, no one wins, truthfully. And we'll explore that a little bit more once we get there. Any other thoughts on competition?
Yeah, that's just something, that's the first thing that came to my mind when I thought of competition is no one wins. And that's I took the test last year, but I never got the results on it, but I'm pretty sure I'm competitive because I mean, I have to prove myself, and I feel like I have to prove myself all the time. And that's kind of, but that was the first thing is it's like in that kind of conflict style, there is no win-win. It's win-lose. That's the only way that, but then you don't really win.
Yeah.
So
Lose-lose.
Yeah, you lose-lose.
Because truthfully, if you were able to engage in constructive conflict, you would have more than you would, even if you flat out won in your competitive one. You would have much more if you had been able to learn how to collaboratively solve the problem and compete it. Okay, we only have a few more minutes left. And so we have 5 minutes left until our hour's up. Thanks for sticking it with me for this long. But we don't have enough time to go through compromise and accommodation. I just wonder if anyone has a preference about which one we have a little discussion about. If anyone feels like, they're one of those and they want to learn a little bit more about it. But yeah, does anyone have a preference about which one we cover?
By preference, do you mean the style that we most use?
Oh no, which one we talk about? We only have 5 minutes left, so I don't think we only have time to talk about one more and kind of how we make that shift. Does anyone have a preference about which one we talk about?
Can we talk about accommodation?
Okay, great. Let's talk about accommodation. Okay, so accommodation, if you remember, it's pretty obvious. We accommodate other people, and so we have high concern for others, low concern for self. So how do we make that transition to collaboration, which is really, how do you think we can help put more value and recognize our own needs and make that shift?
I think the first step to that might be realizing that when you're accommodating someone, you're not necessarily helping them either. Like just with competition, it's also a lose-lose situation. I've noticed a lot of times in conflicts, either someone else just wants to, like give me what I'm wanting or, what we're talking about. And that's not really a very satisfying solution either, because what they think I want isn't like, or what maybe I think they want isn't what's really wanted. It's more of like an absolute resolution to the conflict, because we all try to figure out different ways and styles to kind of help resolve things. And obviously, like, everyone has their own conflict style of what they think works, or maybe not even what works, just what's most comfortable for them. And accommodation is just one where you're just trying to give it to them, kind of, so they'll stop bothering you, or so that they'll get back to liking you. But there's still that negative feeling in the air. So I think realizing that conflict style is not actually helpful towards the other person either is kind of the first step.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Yeah, accommodation as a conflict style actually ends up hurting the relationship more than it would if you'd been able to collaborate. And we talked a little bit about that. There's a couple reasons for that. One, sometimes we assume what other people want. We don't really give them exactly what they need. Sometimes they can tell we're just saying it because we want to accommodate that, and that can be frustrating for them. But I think as well, I think a lot of times what happens when you're an accommodator, I know for me, at least when I accommodate, that this happens. I feel like there's often this underlying resentment that builds up towards the other person, because I'm like, okay, I'm sacrificing this for you, but when do you ever sacrifice something for me? And sometimes accommodation, can be innocent, like, we don't really have a preference on one way or the other. But I think a lot of times that resentment builds up, and even if that resentment doesn't ever get to the point where it kind of explodes, and obviously that's not going to be helpful to the relationship or be needed by that person. Just that underlying resentment, I think, just bleeds into everyday life with them. If it's someone you're really close with and you see a lot, I just feel like that resentment starts to taint all your interactions with them, even if you keep accommodating, because you just grow frustrated after day after day of having to kind of give them what they want. Okay, any other thoughts on accommodation?
I'm so sorry to talk again. I feel like I'm talking this whole time.
You're fine.
I just want to quickly add, I think it was a great example in reading The Anatomy of Peace of seeing Carol, how she admits that she's silently resented, and it's gone up to like hating Lou. And that was definitely her style of conflict. That's what I gathered, was that she was accommodating him and all of his needs, but secretly, like, she started to really resent him throughout the years. And that just built like a rift between their relationship, maybe even subconsciously.
Yeah, and I think, if you're an accommodator, I think this is almost a little bit using accommodating logic against accommodators. If you're an accommodator, you really want to be liked and you really want to meet the needs of another person. But I think when we flip that to say, like, the way you really meet those needs is by being honest and collaborating with them and helping you be in a good space whenever you guys interact. I think that you kind of create this positive feedback loop where if accommodation is really what you say it is, and you're really invested in helping this other person, you're actually going to be better off if you collaborate and you learn how to do that. And I think that recognition helps people who are accommodating. I know it helps me when I'm feeling like I need to accommodate. It helps me, have that courage and have that ability to actually be like, okay, well, maybe I need to say no this time, or maybe I need to have a discussion with them about what some of my needs are, because I really want this relationship to go right. That's all our time for today. We're at exactly 12 o'clock. Thank you all for coming. Thank you guys so much for participating. I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. We didn't quite get to compromising, but that's okay. If anyone has any questions for me, feel free just to stay on after I log off, after everyone logs off, and you can ask it to me, or you can send me an email. But thank you guys all for coming. Great discussion, great comments today, and I'll see you guys all later. You guys are free to go. Thanks.
Thanks, TK.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cool.